Hey guys, welcome to episode 6 of Fatal. I'm your host, Beth McCarty. I first want to thank you all for being such loyal listeners. Those of you who follow the discussion group on Facebook know that this episode was late because I'm having some major issues with my wisdom teeth. I just wanted to let you know that I appreciate all of your support and kind words. Also, thank you so much for the new reviews that we've received on iTunes. I think it's really helped spread the word about Fatal. If you haven't already, please take a minute to subscribe and review on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcast now. Also, join our Facebook discussion group. You can find it on the Fatal Facebook page at facebook.com/fatalpodcast. Now, on to the episode. I'm sure, like myself, many of us take our mother's love for granted. It's just one of those things that just is. We know that no matter what, our mom's going to love us unconditionally. However, that's a myth. Yes, many of us are lucky enough to have that motherly love in our life, but some children, they aren't so lucky. This is the case of the murders of Susan Noir and Sheila Sanders. In the early morning hours on Tuesday, July 17th, 1984, Mabel Harrison noticed a bright light in the woods near Squaw Creek. She made a U-turn and pulled off the road that runs its way south of the Donner Pass towards Lake Tahoe, California. She had to squint to see better, but she noticed that the light that she saw is a fire down by the water's edge at the creek. Now, Mabel wasn't the first passerby to notice the fire. It had already been reported to the Squaw Valley Fire Department about an hour earlier. But Placer County Sheriff Sergeant Stephen Ziegler had already been out to see what it might be, and from his vantage point up on the highway, he thought it looked to be just an isolated stump fire, probably from a lightning strike from a summer storm they had had a few days earlier. He figured it had probably smoldered for a while and was now bursting into flames. The flames were only 2 feet high, and the fire was close to the creek, and far away enough not to be a danger to anybody. So he radioed in at 4:57 a.m. that the fire was isolated and would probably burn itself out. Of course, Mabel Harrison didn't know any of this, so she climbed out of her truck and went to investigate. What she saw and smelled burning was no tree stump. She ran back up the road and flagged down a diesel truck. The truck pulled over to the side of the road, right behind her vehicle. Robert Eden, who was a transport driver from the Central Valley town of Tracy, climbed out of the truck. Mabel told him about the fire down by the water line, and Mr. Eden pulled a fire extinguisher out of his truck. They made their way down to the blazing fire. After spraying out most of the flames, he could make out a figure. It was laid out like on display at a funeral home. He ran back up to the truck and got a 3-gallon jug of water, and then extinguished the rest of the flames with the water. Mabel thought it looked like a mannequin, but Mr. Eden knew it was a body. The body was a young female, in her late teens, although at the time, it was hard to tell whether it was male or female. The only part of the human remains that was not blackened was the left side of the face. The coroner was later able to tell that the girl had blue eyes, but Mabel and Mr. Eden couldn't see that at the time, as the one eye that wasn't burnt was closed. While living, the young woman had pale skin and long, wavy, light brown or blonde hair. She was 5 feet 3 inches tall, and now she was unrecognizable. Mabel went back up to the road to flag down the next car that came their way. About 15 minutes later, a sheriff's patrol car pulled up. There were 2 deputies, and they asked Mabel what had happened. She explained that there was a burning body down by the creek. So the deputies asked her to stay there, and they took their vehicle off-road and down to the creek. Once the deputies saw what they were dealing with, they backed away from the body and asked Mr. Eden to stay back as well. They wanted to try to preserve what they could of the crime scene.
A citizen called the office at about 4:30 in the morning told the dispatch center that there was a body burning alongside the highway. So our patrol units were dispatched, and the fire was still going. And she was laying right here, about 25 feet off the highway. The majority of her body had been burned. The clothing that she was wearing had been burned. The left side of her face was about the only part of her body that did not burn, in addition to her back and her legs, because they were on the ground.
There was absolutely no identification on this body. There were no witnesses that ever came forward.
She had duct tape across her cheeks and mouth and lips, and she had duct tape on her hands.
The young woman's body became known as Jane Doe number 4858-84. It was nearly 7 a.m. when homicide detectives Russell Potts and Larry Adams pulled up to the scene. Unfortunately, finding dead bodies along the highways of the Sierras was nothing new for Potts and Adams. In all, nearly 200 murder victims had been dumped or buried beneath the pines over the past decade. Taking a Polaroid camera, an evidence kit, and 2 arson investigators from the Tahoe City Fire Department, they made their way down to the creek bank. Tests came up positive, showing that the body had been doused with a flammable liquid. Detectives worked for the next 4 hours, taking photographs and collecting evidence. By mid-morning, Potts and Adams had been joined by investigators, criminalists, and photographers from the State Department of Justice in Sacramento, as well as a small army of deputies from the main office of the Placer County Sheriff's Department. In all, 31 pieces of evidence were found and cataloged. This included a green Pepsodent toothbrush, an underwire size 32C JCPenney bra, disposable diapers, a pair of Gloria Vanderbilt jeans, a yellow and black scarf, brown high heels, black flip-flops, a pair of hoop earrings, a pair of sleigh bell earrings, a heavy bracelet inlaid with black onyx, and the singed pages from a couple of books, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and A Harlequin Romance. There was more, but the 2 plastic trash bags that contained most of the remaining effects had been set on fire along with Jane Doe. As for Jane Doe herself, her mouth had been taped shut with silver duct tape, and her wrists had been taped together. She wore an old-style white gold wedding ring, studded with diamond chips. She had been wearing a yellow nylon windbreaker, a white knit sweater, brown corduroy jacket, and a pair of corduroy pants. Her hair was in a ponytail, tied off with a bright yellow rubber band. Jane Doe had suffered third-degree burns to 91% of her body. At 1:59 p.m., Placer County Sheriff Donald Nunes put out the first of several teletypes to the Missing Persons Division of Police and Sheriff's Departments all over the state. It read, "Request you check your records for any missing persons which may match this Jane Doe or any similar homicides. Thanks in advance." At 2 p.m., a driver from the county removal service arrived. He loaded the body in his truck and drove it down the mountain, over Donner Pass, to Auburn and the Placer County morgue. The autopsy began 2 hours later. It was determined that the remains were from a teenage to young adult Caucasian female. Her hands were curled into fists, and the right ear was burned to ashes, and her lips were burned away on the right side. After a dentist assisted with the exam, it was determined that she was between 14 and 17 years old. It was also determined that the cause of death was the fire. The girl had been burned alive. On July 26th, Jane Doe's remains were x-rayed and frozen at the Sacramento County Coroner's morgue. Under the law, her corpse had to remain under lock and key for 90 days in the event that investigators needed another look. Newspaper reports of the murder generated calls coming in daily for the rest of the month with tips. By the end of August, Detective Potts and Adams had investigated about 200 of those leads and were no closer to an identity of Jane Doe or the killer. They were able to pull a print from her right thumb before she was frozen, but a month after the body was found, there was no match with any of the prints of missing persons submitted. There were also some prints taken from glass bottles from the crime scene, but those had not been matched with any potential suspects either. As September approached and a new school year was beginning, Potts made up a flyer with relevant information about Jane Doe and an artist rendering of what they thought she must have looked like when she was alive. And Potts sent the flyer to districts all over the state, but there was never any response. He was hoping that one of the students or faculty at the schools would recognize the Jane Doe. After months had passed, the leads on Jane Doe diminished, and at the end of 90 days, she remained Jane Doe, number 4858-84. And on October 25th, she was laid to rest at the New Auburn District Cemetery. By the following May, Potts had received an FBI printout with 235 possible matches on the fingerprints that he had submitted the previous fall. His secretary called all 235 police agencies to follow up, but on June 18, 1985, his official report read that all contacts had been negative, and the case stayed filed away for 8 more years, until 22-year-old Teresa Marie Groves made a call to the Placer County Sheriff's Office in October of 1993. She spent the next several hours trying to make detectives believe the questionable story that was her life, her family, her survival, and her mother and namesake, Teresa Jimmy Francine Cross. Rio Linda is 100 miles west of the Donner Pass. This is where Teresa Cross grew up and passed through adolescence in the 50s and early 60s. She lived with her father, mother, and older sister Rosemary. On September 29, 1962, Teresa married Cliff Sanders. She was just 16 years old, and her father had to sign a consent form for them to be able to marry. Her mother had passed away by this time, and her father was ill. He was suffering from Parkinson's. On July 16, 1963, Teresa gave birth to her first child, a son, Howard Sanders. The relationship between Teresa and Cliff had grown tumultuous. They were fighting very often, and there were rumors of infidelity in the marriage. Teresa became pregnant again in the spring of 1964, and Cliff questioned if the child was even his. That was it for Teresa, though. She had had enough. By June of that year, 18-year-old Teresa and young Howard moved out of the house and into a tiny white house in Galt. That was about 20 miles from Sacramento. But after a cooling off period, Cliff came to Galt to reconnect with his wife and son. It didn't take long for the war between him and Teresa to start again, though. James Cross, who is Teresa's father, had moved in with her and the baby when they relocated to Galt. He was now completely disabled by Parkinson's and was unable to referee the fights between his daughter and her husband. On June 22, 1964, Cliff had been out drinking, and he came home and him and Teresa had started fighting. He threw her purse against the living room window and broke the glass. She later told the police that he had hit her. She went to the Galt police and showed them the bruises around her wrists and neck, and told them that she wanted Cliff arrested. She filed assault and battery charges against her husband, but when it came time to booking, she refused to press charges. On July 5th, Cliff celebrated his 23rd birthday, but it was far from happy. Things had continued to deteriorate between him and Teresa. She accused him of sleeping around, and Cliff still went on about the baby that she was carrying not being his. On Monday, July 6th, Cliff packed his bags to leave once and for all, but he never made it past the front door. Cliff had beaten Teresa before, and he had told her that he was going to beat her again. Then he was going to take all the money they had and leave her. He had already packed a suitcase and a box when Teresa went to the bedroom, got the Winchester lever-action deer rifle, and returned to the living room. Cliff was just about to walk out the door when she aimed the gun and held her finger on the trigger. She later said that she grabbed the gun to make him keep from hitting her, and the gun went off accidentally. She claimed that that was all she could remember. A single .30-30 cartridge penetrated Cliff's heart. The coroner said that Cliff apparently held up his left hand to fend off the bullet because it shattered his wrist before striking him in the chest. He took several steps towards the back door before he tripped and fell, landing on his back and staring straight up at the ceiling. Teresa was scared by what had just happened and probably shocked. She put the rifle against the wall, grabbed the baby and her purse, and raced outside to the car. She stopped at a nearby neighbor's house. The May's son was the one to answer the door, and he rushed to wake his parents when Teresa said she needed help. Isabel May called for an ambulance, while Fred May sat Teresa and the baby down in a chair. Fred went across the street to investigate, and Isabel tried to comfort Teresa. Teresa was hysterical. She kept saying that she hadn't meant to shoot him and that she didn't think that old gun could hurt somebody so badly. She said that she had shot him in the arm. Police and an ambulance arrived, and Teresa still didn't realize the truth about her husband actually being dead at this time. The Galt police chief helped Teresa into the back seat of a squad car and started towards the police station before he finally broke the news to her. Isabel said she still remembers her scream. She said it was blood-curdling. It was a chilling scream that could be heard all the way down the street until the squad car turned the corner and headed for the jail. Teresa was given a sedative, and the next order of business was to see what to do with baby Howard. Teresa gave them an address in Rio Linda and instructed him to take the baby there. Then Teresa went to jail in Sacramento, not Gate. Teresa's attorney asked permission for her to attend her late husband's funeral 3 days after her arrest. The judge ordered the sheriff's department to escort her to and from the 3 p.m. burial. Teresa was heard in front of a grand jury, and after testimony and 2.5 hours of deliberation, it was decided that she would be indicted on first-degree murder charges. Teresa entered a plea of not guilty, and her trial date was set for September 10th. Judge Charles Johnson was assigned the case. The trial began and the first witness was called. It was Fred May. He recounted the tale of Teresa knocking on the door wearing a nightgown and holding a baby. He described how he had found Cliff lying on his back in a pool of blood at the back door of the little house. Then Chief Deputy Coroner Ray Thielen took the stand and picked up the tale about Cliff's body being taken to the morgue for autopsy, how the crime scene was sealed off and photographed, and how Thielen found the murder weapon leaning against the door jamb, along with the expended cartridge shell, and how Chief Deputy District Attorney Ed Garcia visited the crime scene and made the decision to put his agency's own investigators on the case, rather than the Galt Police Department. On the second day of the trial, Thielen finished his testimony, and Dr. Arthur Wallace took the stand and described the autopsy result. Firearms expert David Bird was next, detailing his test of the deer rifle, which proved that it was in fact the murder weapon. There were 10 photos entered into evidence along with the autopsy and a diagram of the house at 586 Elm Avenue. The deer rifle, 2 live and 1 expended cartridge, and the slug that Dr. Wallace had removed from Mr. Sanders' heart. Bob Zarek began Teresa's defense. He told the jury that his client had been a victim of Sanders' vicious attacks for months. He talked of her being punched in the face, burned with cigarettes, pushed to the floor, and kicked. He explained that this wasn't a case of murder, but of self-preservation. Teresa did what she had to do to survive, not only for herself, but for her young son, and for the baby she was now carrying. He claimed that it was not her intent to kill her husband, but to stop him from beating her, and the gun just went off in her untrained hands. Zarek called Teresa to the stand. She described the beatings that she had endured, and how she had never meant to kill her husband. She went on for nearly 2 hours. Teresa had several people to testify on her behalf, Even the police officers that arrested her testified for the defense. Lily Hansen, Cliff's sister, testified after much back and forth with her testimony being allowed, since it was hearsay from the deceased. She testified that she believed with all of her heart that Teresa had planned to kill her brother. That 2 months before Cliff had died, Teresa said she would shoot Cliff before she would let another woman have him. That she had a gun and he had better walk a chalk line or she'd kill him. Furthermore, that this was not the first time that Teresa had shot at Cliff. Before he died, Cliff had showed Lily a bullet hole in the floor of the home where the couple had lived. Teresa had shot and missed. She also once told Lily that she thought of using ant poison, but then an autopsy would show it and she wasn't stupid, and she'd get a gun and shoot him and make it look like an accident. Lily also stated that she did not wish to imprison her sister-in-law because her nephew needed his mother. Zarek asked Judge Johnson to set bail for Teresa, and shockingly enough to the prosecutor, Teresa was released on a $4,000 bail. The trial continued, and a surprise witness for the defense, Dr. Stanley Whiteheimer, a physician who testified that he had treated Teresa for facial injuries in 1963, injuries she claimed to have received when Cliff hit her. The defense then rested. Closing arguments began, and the prosecutor claimed that Teresa deliberately killed her husband, maybe in the heat of the moment, but still intentionally. The defense's closing argument was straightforward. A homicide is justified and not punishable when committed by a person in the lawful defense of herself. The jury stepped out at 11:03 a.m. and returned at 2:45 p.m. with a verdict: not guilty. After the trial, Teresa really had nowhere to go. She was without a job, homeless, and pregnant. She was invited to stay with a family that had taken in her young son while she was incarcerated. The Howards agreed to let Teresa stay there as long as she re-enrolled in school. She didn't go out on any dates. She took care of the baby and helped out around the house. However, Teresa broke the rules within a week. It wasn't long before Teresa started dating a man named Lee Thornsberry. He got her a little apartment and moved in with her, helping her through her last few months of pregnancy. Lee was a paralyzed veteran, and he felt that Teresa was damaged emotionally, just like he was damaged physically. On March 13th, 1965, Sheila Sanders was born. After Sheila was born, Lee had gotten them a little house and they all moved in together. A short time into the relationship, though, Teresa started stepping out on Lee, and he found evidence in the car. Lee's sister, Virginia, would come around and help with the kids since Teresa was here and there all the time. Virginia said that when Teresa was around, you could tell that she favored Howard, her son, much more than her daughter Sheila. For example, one day Sheila had gotten in trouble for something, and Teresa had scolded her. Sheila was crawling around crying, just looking for someone to pick her up. Bob Noir became one of Teresa's mystery men. Teresa had told him that she hated Sheila from day one because she was pregnant with her when she killed Cliff. Teresa would go out with Bob or out to bars and either leave the kids at home or take them with her and leave them locked up in the back seat for hours at a time. Lee took being humiliated for the better part of a year, but he finally broke up with Teresa. Lee moved out of the house that they shared near the end of 1965, but Teresa stayed on through the first of the year. Bob Noir had joined the Marine Corps a year before he and Teresa had met. And at the time they met, Bob knew nothing about Teresa. He didn't know she already had 2 children or that she had been acquitted for murdering her husband. Bob left for Hawaii to finish up training before being shipped off to Vietnam. This was right after Christmas. He wasn't gone 3 weeks when Teresa was calling him saying that she was coming to Hawaii, that she had borrowed some money from friends, and sure enough she came. She stayed with some friends of his off base for the next 3 weeks. And by the time his unit left for Vietnam in February of 1966, Teresa let Bob know that she was carrying his child. Teresa stayed on in Hawaii a while longer after Bob shipped out. Bob Noir was in love. He was confident when he shipped out to Vietnam, but that was short-lived. He arrived in February, and by March he was shot. Luckily, it was only a flesh wound. He was back on patrol within a few days. Less than a month later, he was hit again, this time shot by a sniper in the fatty part of his side. He was once again lucky as the bullet barely penetrated his skin, and after a couple of weeks, he was back out with his unit. The final blow was when he and his unit were crossing a bridge and a mine was triggered. He got shrapnel in his arms, legs, and back. 4 other men in his unit were injured, some very badly. They were all shipped back to Oakland, California Naval Hospital, and the war experience was over for Bob. On July 6, 1966, Teresa and Bob were married. Teresa was about 6 or 7 months pregnant by this time, and she was still showing favoritism with her children. Howard was bright and unafraid, while Sheila was slow and fearful. It was as if Sheila's growth and behavior had been stunted. Appearances were extremely important to Teresa, though, so she was very careful about anyone seeing her bad treatment of Sheila. Bob's Aunt Evie Works said she remembered a time when she had went to pick up Sheila and found that Sheila's head was completely shaved. There were little cuts all over the top of her head, and when she asked Teresa what was wrong with the girl's head, Teresa told her that she just sat her down and shaved her head, and every time she pulled the razor, she wanted to go down into her brain with it, but she didn't have the guts to do it. Teresa let Sheila go stay with Evie and her husband when she was going through the final months of her pregnancy. When they took over Sheila's care, they took her to a doctor because they noticed abrasions on her feet and ankles. The doctors told them that they were bed sores from the child being forced to lay in bed under the sheets all the time. For the first 6 months of her staying with Evie and her husband, Sheila was pretty much mute. But after about 6 months, she finally started opening up a bit, and she would talk up a storm as long as Teresa wasn't around. On September 27th, 1966, Teresa gave birth to her 3rd child. She named the little girl Susan Marlene Noir. Teresa arranged to move her father and herself out of the low-income apartment in Sacramento and into a house in San Francisco so that she could be closer to Bob. Bob was assigned temporary duty status and was being treated as an outpatient at the Oakland Naval Hospital. His military doctors had determined that his wounds had partially disabled him, but not enough to warrant a medical discharge. He continued serving as a Marine and was awarded the Bronze Star and put back to work. Although they had only been married a few months, Bob could already sense a subtle change in Teresa's attitude. Teresa had told Bob that if she ever caught him fooling around on her, or if he ever left her, she wouldn't hesitate to shoot him. Less than 3 months after Susan was born, Teresa became pregnant again. William Robert Noir was born on September 15th, 1967. Teresa decided around this time that she wanted Sheila back. She thought that Evie and Pat Works were a bad influence on her. In all reality, Bob said that he thinks she was more scared of them adopting Sheila, and in turn, being the ones who would then get her Social Security check for the survivor's benefits from her father's death. The relationship between Bob and Teresa was beginning to have its difficulties. Bob was traveling a lot, as it was now his responsibility to handle funerals, so he escorted the bodies to and from their destinations. Teresa was jealous and didn't trust him, so she would call him every hour that he was gone. She also started harassing him, and all around just being a mean person. Teresa rarely smiled and never laughed. They didn't make time to spend any time alone, and by the summer of 1968, they had 4 children between them and a 5th on the way. Bob claims that he was faithful to Teresa the entire time they were together, but Teresa didn't believe him. The longer they were married, the more aggravated Teresa became about his alleged adultery. Then one night, Bob came home and Teresa, the children, and all the furniture was gone. Bob tracked her down after talking to her sister, Rosemary. He convinced her to come back and give it another shot. Teresa gave birth to her 5th and Bob's 3rd child, and named him Robert Wallace Noir Jr. The baby may have brought Teresa and Bob back together again, but it certainly didn't make things any easier. By June of 1969, things between the couple had deteriorated between them to the point that Bob moved out of the family home. Teresa filed for divorce on grounds of extreme cruelty. And by the end of the month, Teresa ended up dropping that suit for divorce, and Bob came back. They moved thinking a new location may help. They loaded up the kids, Teresa's father, and all of their belongings, and headed for Spokane to start a new life. Bob was finally able to get approved for military medical disability, and he was missing sunny California. So after the approval went through, he packed up the family again and they moved right back to Sacramento. Shortly after the return, Teresa announced that she was pregnant again. The jealousy continued in the relationship. Bob was sure that Teresa was sneaking around and having affairs, and she accused him of the same. Their constant bickering back and forth escalated into physical altercations, and by spring of 1970, the marriage was over. The divorce became final on July 3rd, 1970. Teresa waived alimony, and the court ordered Bob to pay $150 a month in child support. Funnily enough, the judge who signed their divorce papers was Judge Charles Johnson, and that was the same judge who had presided over Teresa's murder trial. Bob started seeing another woman shortly after the divorce, and unfortunately Teresa had not decided if she was fully able to let him go. She still thought of him as her property, and she began to stalk Bob and his new lady friend. Bob wanted to visit with his children, but Teresa was doing such a good job at making his life miserable that he couldn't even bear to be around her anymore. And he was honestly kind of scared of how she may act. Teresa had her sixth child and named her Teresa Marie Noir. She was born August 5th, 1970, and she called her Terry. Teresa would let Bob and his girlfriend Georgia come to the house for short visits, but she made it impossible most of the time for Bob to leave with the kids. Although their visits were short, Georgia also noticed the mean behavior and spiteful abuse that Teresa showed towards all of the children, but especially the girls. Bob and Georgia were soon married, and just a few months later, Teresa also remarried a man named Ron Pulliam on March 27th, 1971. Ron took an active interest in Teresa's kids from the very beginning. He treated the 3 boys and 3 girls as if they were all his own. Teresa began poisoning her children against Bob. She told them that he had a drug problem and he was prone to violence. And these stories stuck with the kids, even after they grew to be adults. According to Bob, he did have a drug problem, but he was never abusive towards the children. He said the stories of abuse came from Teresa's imagination and were then drilled into her children's memories. Teresa told Bob that if he didn't pay his child support, pay for her wedding rings, and get rid of his wife, he wouldn't be able to see the kids anymore. And after months of trying, Bob just gave up. Out of nowhere, a year and a half later, Ron, Teresa's husband, came to Bob and Georgia saying that he couldn't find Teresa. She had started leaving the kids home alone with Ron or in the care of her oldest, Howard. The kids were missing a lot of school. Teresa wasn't home half the time, and then one day he said she was just gone. Ron had already filed for divorce. He wasn't one to sit around and tolerate Teresa's treatment, and their divorce became final on September 27th, 1972. They did continue to live together as a family even after their divorce was final, though. That was until Teresa told Ron that she had met a younger man by the name of Ron Bullington. It was a short-lived relationship, and Bullington left Teresa as well. There were other men after him, but none stayed with her for very long. Teresa was very strict on their children as they grew older. She disciplined them often. She had this board that was about 1 inch thick and 4 feet long, with a grip at one end, and she called it her board of education. She used this to discipline the kids. Teresa told her children lies, And of course they believed them because they didn't know any better. She was very hot and cold, and there seemed to be no in between. She was either jumping down their throats all the time, or she would just ignore them completely. All 6 children spent most of their grammar school years trying to second guess these signs of an impending explosion from their mom. Terry thought that she had become pretty good at predicting her mom's next tantrum, but she never became an expert. One example given was when Teresa went to a parent-teacher conference when Terry was in 3rd grade. Her 3rd grade teacher greeted Teresa with a smile, an arched eyebrow, and a cheery, "I've heard a lot about you." Terry walked up to her mom and wrapped her in a hug around the waist, telling her that she loved her. And Teresa just looked at her blankly and didn't say anything. But Terry said when she got home from school that day, Teresa locked her in the deep freezer because she thought that Terry had said bad things about her to the teacher. Teresa and Howard sat on top of the freezer to make sure she couldn't get out. In another incident, a friend of Terry's who lived nearby had grown out of some of her old name brand clothes, and her mom offered them to Terry. Teresa thought that Terry was going around complaining to people that they were too poor to buy clothes. So as a punishment, Terry was stripped naked and ordered to stand with her face against a door. Teresa then looped a rope around her neck and then tossed the loose end of the rope over the top of the door and had one of the other kids hold on to it so that Terry's naked body was stretched upward against the door. Teresa then got a willow branch from the yard and proceeded to lay into her daughter's flesh. Terry said that she whipped her so long and hard that she nearly passed out. She was 6 at the time. Teresa's explosions could be triggered by almost anything, and they grew worse and more frequent over the years. A lot of times, because of Teresa's drinking, the burden of keeping the house running was put on Howard. Teresa started working at various nursing homes and hospitals as a caregiver. She eventually became a certified nurse's assistant. When she wasn't working, she continued to drink. And after she'd had a few drinks in her, her personality would change completely. She was still going to bars often, trying to pick up men, but it seemed to become harder and harder for her to do that. That is until she met Chet Harris. Chet was nearly 60 when he became Teresa's 4th and final husband. Chet had once been a journalist. He had written 3 books and worked on more than a half a dozen newspapers before he moved to California. He was no longer a journalist by this time, but he still worked for a newspaper. Chet was described by others as pretty gross. He was obese, he didn't take care of himself, and he was a heavy drinker. He somehow managed to marry several times, though. Teresa and Chet met in 1976. Chet was twice her age and twice her size. They were married a few days after meeting on August 23rd, 1976. Now, Teresa was pretty much just using Chet to pay her bills and build a larger, newer house for herself and her children. She never kept this as a secret from the kids. She also saw Chet as a way to torture and hopefully lure Bob Noir back into her life. Chet was pretty cruel to the children, though. He had nicknames for them all, except for Susan. She was his pet. She was 10 at the time. Susan ended up being tested, and it was found that she was mentally 4 years ahead of where she should be for her age. She was a bit awkward, though, and Chet helped to bring her out of her shell. On November 22nd, 1976, Teresa filed an affidavit with the court for a divorce from Chet. Their marriage lasted 2 months and 7 days, and officially ended on December 17th, 1976. Teresa stopped the sale of her home, and she and the kids all moved back in. Teresa grew more reclusive, more unpredictable, and more violent, but nobody outside of her immediate family knew anything about it. The children never admitted or even knew, really, that they were being abused. They all thought it was normal. It was the only thing that they knew. As they got older, they started to complain about not being able to have friends over, but if they whined too much, they were slapped into silence. They didn't realize that their contact with the outside world was slowly disappearing. The children's blind obedience to their mother stemmed from a constant state of terror that remained invisible to everyone around them. Teresa would beat them, lock them in their rooms for days, and then be all lovey-dovey. She played the part of a mother, but she also played the part of a very torturous, sadistic human being. Teresa started reading the Bible around the time she started becoming abusive. And the more she read the Bible, the more she twisted what it was saying. She would use that and her beliefs to explain why she was beating the children for doing certain things. Howard became her new tool of discipline. During fits of rage, she would have Howard hold the other children down. Her youngest daughter, Terry, said that at the age of 6, she was sodomized by her brother Howard, and that he also molested her. Howard was basically sexually exploiting the entire household. His younger brother Robert said that once Howard ordered Robert to mount his sister Susan, and when Robert refused, Howard raped her and made Robert watch. When Teresa found out what was going on, she literally broke a chair over his back. She beat him really badly, and from that point on, he never did it again. In my opinion, that may be the one favor that she ever did for any of her children. Howard started defying Teresa. He was pissed that he couldn't have any friends over or leave the house. He wanted more, and he found it in drugs. Howard initiated all of his siblings into the use of different controlled substances. All through junior high and high school, Howard developed a reputation as a user and seller of all sorts of drugs, including these exotic street cocktails and prescription meds that his mom was stealing from the convalescent homes where she worked. Howard started having buyers running in and out of the house, just buying dope all the time. And Teresa knew that he was dealing drugs out of her house, but on one hand, she could no longer control him with force, and on the other, he had started paying rent by that time, and she needed the money. So she would just kind of hide out in her room and read the Bible. Teresa thought that Susan was a witch. Apparently, for the short time that she was married to Chet Harris, he was really into the occult. And he had turned Teresa and Susan onto it. Susan told Teresa that Chet had planned on initiating her into his witch's coven. Susan's strong will, quick wit, and growing good looks did nothing to lessen Teresa's conviction that she had made some sort of unholy pact during her time as Chet's stepdaughter. Susan began growing into a very attractive young woman. She wore glasses, which kids made fun of her for, but after a while, even the glasses couldn't hide that her boobs were growing, she had these hips now, and she had this long, beautiful, dark blonde hair. By contrast, Sheila seemed slower and more intimidated. Compared to blonde and beautiful Susan, Sheila was dark-haired, petite, and not nearly as full of life. Teresa had turned her into somewhat of a Cinderella story years earlier. She basically used Sheila as her slave, forcing her to clean up after everyone, and she had no hope of a fairy godmother. When their children became teenagers, the first and most frequent victim of Teresa's beatings, while Howard pinned her arms behind her and kept her feet from kicking, was Susan. If she broke free or fought back, Teresa asked her other sons to help hold her down as well. And Teresa would slam her with fists, feet, and that dreaded board of education that she made. The boys had much less to fear than the girls. They had to actually break a rule to deserve a slap. The girls, on the other hand, could wind up on the floor writhing in pain, never even knowing what they had done to deserve the beating. Teresa gave most of her wrath to her girls, especially Susan. Sheila ended up dropping out of school in the 9th grade. Teresa began thinking that she was mentally slow enough that she could probably collect a check off of her from Social Security. So she made an appointment and had Sheila not shower for a week and dressed her in these gross clothes. So before the appointment, she kind of coached her as well. And Sheila purposely did badly on the mental competency test. And she did end up getting approved for Social Security, with Teresa being the payee since Sheila was found mentally incompetent. Susan quit school somewhere between the 7th and 8th grades, just as the real trouble began with her mother. Susan had been a straight A student all her life. Teresa told all of the other children that Susan quit school because she was a witch. Teresa started doing midnight checks on Susan to make sure that she was not leaving the house. And on one of those nights, Teresa found strands of hair and some dried flakes of dead human skin tucked away in a little plastic bag under Susan's pillow. Teresa slapped Susan awake and demanded to know what the meaning of the contents of the little bag were. And Susan defiantly told her that Chet needed it for one of his spells. Teresa said that Susan was no longer her daughter and that she had sold her soul to the devil. Susan ended up running away. She went to a place called the Receiving House. This was sort of like a group home for children. And how she had ended up there has never really been 100% verified. The two versions that I got were either Susan ran away and found herself there, or Teresa dropped her off on the doorstep one day. Either way, it was not the fresh new start that Susan had hoped for, and she ended up running away from the Receiving House as well. She lived on the streets of the Del Paso Heights, or Northtown section of Sacramento, hiding out from police and falling in with other runaways. She turned on to whatever street drugs she could find and ended up turning tricks to earn money for food, using men the same way that she had seen her mother use them. Susan was eventually picked up by the police, and from there she was taken to the Sutter Memorial Psychiatric Ward, downtown. Her siblings weren't really sure why she ended up there, if it was some sort of evaluation done, or, something along those lines. But after her time in the psych hospital, she was returned to the Receiving House, but soon went back to live with her mom. Terry remembers the day that they went to go pick her up from the Receiving House. Susan had been pleading with her counselor not to send her back, claiming that her home was like a concentration camp, and that her mom was like the warden. When Teresa and Terry arrived to pick Susan up, the counselor explained what Susan had been telling them, and that she was a victim of the worst kind of abuse. And Teresa looked the counselor straight in the face and told her that it was all lies. On the way home, Teresa told Susan, "If you think you were abused before, you just wait. I'll show you what abused is." Once they arrived back at their house, Teresa let loose all of her rage. If Susan winced or showed the least defiance, she was beat even harder. Teresa put these leather gloves on before beating her to protect her own hands. The other children were forced to stay in the room and watch the horror. Susan's brothers and sisters were then lined up in order of size and age, and one by one the gloves were passed between them, and they were each forced to punch their sister in the abdomen. That night and every night after, the other children took turns keeping watch over Susan to make sure that she wouldn't leave again. Teresa even got herself a pair of handcuffs and shackled Susan to the headboard of the bed. Her siblings said that this is ultimately what broke Susan's spirit. She never tried to run again. In 1981, little Bill Noir was in a fight at school. He wasn't really the fighting type, and initially declined the bully's invitation to brawl over a girl who had been paying him some attention. The bully beat Bill around the head with a padlock from his locker, and school officials rushed Bill to the hospital. He suffered a mild concussion. Howard, who wasn't getting along with his mom at the time, was staying more at a friend's house than he was at home, but he still kind of felt like a father figure to the family. If one of the younger children needed a defender, Howard was it. So Howard was a senior in high school at the time that Bill's fight happened, and he wanted revenge, even if Bill didn't. As the school's best-known dope dealer, Howard had the pull to get the revenge that he wanted. He actually got the football team in full-dress football gear, and they went out and surrounded the bully, so the teachers wouldn't be able to stop him. Then Howard beat the living hell out of him for jumping Bill. The bully was just as big as Howard, but Howard gave his all in that first punch, and the bully didn't fall to the ground. But apparently he was already knocked out on his feet. Unfortunately, Howard was the type of fighter that he kept punching you until you just didn't move anymore. And since the kid hadn't fallen to the ground, Howard kept punching. The girl who had originally started the altercation between Bill and the bully even got in on the action. She jumped on Howard's back, shrieking. She was accidentally hit by Howard because he was in the process of trying to land another blow on the bully. But in order to save Howard, the dishonor of being accused of hitting a female, several of the other freshman girls who liked and admired Bill and Howard actually pounced on the girl. When it was over, the bully was sent to the hospital with a concussion, and Howard was arrested for battery. As a minor, he was given 3 years probation. Terry, being the youngest of the children, tried to keep her role as the baby of the family. She lived in her own imagination a lot, trying to block out the reality in which she lived. Her attempts at trying to preserve her childhood were brought to a halt one day when she was crossing a vacant lot after school. 3 boys blocked her way. She came home hours later with a tear-streaked face and torn and dirty clothes. She told Teresa that she had been dragged into a shack and held down by 2 of the boys while the 3rd one raped her. She got no sympathy. Terry was stunned. There was no call to the police. There was no outrage. But she was punished for coming home late and in dirty clothes. Teresa believed that the story that Terry had told her was just validation that her youngest daughter was a liar. And if it was true, and she were raped, then she must be a slut who brought it on herself by teasing the boys. Teresa didn't want to bring any attention to herself and her family by calling the police anyway. It was the same reason she didn't call 911 the day that Susan was shot. Bill and Howard were not home at the time. It was just Robert, the girls, and Teresa. As usual, a battle started brewing between Teresa and Susan. And Susan was cornered in the hallway, with Teresa shouting at her, accusing her of casting a spell on her, which was making her gain more and more weight. She had already hit Susan with a belt a few times when Sheila and Robert came up to see what was going on. Terry was a few feet away across the hall. Susan was up against the wall, between the bathroom door and the door to Teresa's bedroom, and Robert was told to restrain Susan. The next thing everyone knew, a shot had been fired. Terry remembered that there was a lot of screaming, and she remembers Susan grabbing her chest after she heard the pop of the gunshot. Susan then gasped, grabbed onto the doorframe of the bathroom, and then fell into the bathtub. The bullet had entered under Susan's left breast. There was a lot of blood, and the children all watched in horror as Susan sank back into an empty bathtub. And Teresa underwent a sudden and miraculous transformation, switching instantly from a deranged aggressor hell-bent on beating the evil out of her daughter to a concerned practical nurse. She pulled Susan's clothes off, searching for the damage the bullet had done, and she found the bullet hole, but there was no exit wound. As a nurse, Teresa was in her element. She had all of the supplies she needed since she had stolen so much from all the convalescent homes she worked at before, and she was able to treat her daughter's wound. She was not going to take Susan to an ER where there would be too many questions. Teresa had collected a large selection of pills over the years and came up with her own prescriptions for Susan's needs. She gave her antibiotics and some ibuprofen and Flexeril for pain. Susan was left in the bathtub for the next month, propped up with pillows and covered with a blanket. When Susan needed to use the bathroom, she just did, and the family would just wash her off and flush her waste down the drain. Luckily, the wound was not fatal. The bullet had somehow missed any major arteries or organs, and Susan was up and walking within a few weeks, and moved from the bathtub back to her bed. Teresa would come in and talk to her in an effort to talk the demon into dropping the weight curse it had put on her. Susan grew stronger over time and prettier. The healing time had caused her appetite to go down, and she was now model thin, with big breasts, a small waist, and hips. Susan made a full recovery. A few weeks later, Teresa decided to have Susan exorcised. She took Susan to see a pastor of the Hazel Avenue Baptist Church to try to have an exorcism performed. The Baptist church wouldn't do it. They were actually told not to come to the church anymore, not by the pastor, but by other church members. Since Teresa couldn't get any help from the church, she decided to perform the ritual herself. In the spring of 1983, she waited until after midnight and had her children hold a seance, although she didn't tell them what she was up to. Teresa claimed to have had a vision of her oldest son, Howard, hiding in a closet with her 22, and she believed he was planning to kill her. So she ran away. She left the kids, and she went to North Sacramento and rented a hotel room. She didn't tell any of the children where she was going, and they began to worry after she didn't return after a couple of nights. On the third day, though, she walked through the front door. And Teresa told Robert the night of the seance, all of the children had went into some sort of trance. Teresa remained alert the whole time, and after a time, she began to see red beams of light flashing through the front windows. The lights pierced the back of each of her children's heads, signaling their possession, she said. Then she said she heard a voice, which offered her a cure for her disease, if she would have the rest of the family follow the coven. The voice told her that she and her children were all descended from the tribe of David through the cross bloodline, and that she could have her youthful slenderness and health back. But in order for that to happen, the cross line had to be wiped off the face of the earth. And supposedly Teresa refused this. In June of 1983, Howard brought his high school sweetheart home to live. They were going to get married, but just wanted to live together for the moment. Connie Sue Butler had just graduated high school, and Connie said that Teresa was pleasant to her at first. Teresa was so happy to have Howard home, she welcomed Connie with open arms, and even gave up the master bedroom and began sleeping on the couch. Connie said that Howard began to change over the 6 months that she lived there, though. He turned from a sensitive, vulnerable guy beneath a macho swagger to nothing but the macho swagger. He was abusive to his siblings and his mom while they were there, and he slapped Connie around too. It wasn't cops or drugs or bill collectors who eventually ran the family out of the neighborhood, though. They were actually ran out by the biker gang, the Hells Angels. Apparently Howard had a BB gun that he had used out back for target practice, and the family who moved into the house behind them had twin daughters who were scared of Howard and his BB gun. The mom of the twins had asked Howard to stop, and he refused, so she turned to a family friend for help, and that friend turned out to be a member of the Hells Angels. Teresa was told to sell the house and move on, or the gang would trash her house and beat her and her entire family to a pulp. Teresa put the house up for sale that same week. They moved into an apartment about 10 miles away. It was in a rundown section of North Sacramento, but not nearly the worst neighborhood in the city. Their new home was between a trailer park and a tavern. Not long after they had moved in, Teresa got a call from the police. She was informed that a man who was out walking his dog just after 9 p.m. on November 30th, 1983, had found a body of a woman. That body was identified the following morning by Floyd Norris as his wife of 19 years, Rosemary Norris, Teresa's sister. Floyd said that he had been out of the state on business when she died. Rosemary had been strangled to death. The police began to look at Floyd for Rosemary's death. There were inconsistencies in his story, and he had 4 life insurance policies on Rosemary, totaling somewhere around $250,000. There was never enough evidence to charge him with anything, and her murder has still never been solved. Teresa was still convinced that Susan was casting spells on her to make her gain weight. And although she always made Susan eat everything on her plate and then some, Susan was not gaining any weight. Teresa started force-feeding Susan when she refused to eat, and Susan would throw up. So Teresa started cooking a concoction of flour and mineral oil to bind her up, to make her keep things down. She was feeding her foods that were swimming in grease. Connie and Howard got married on June 1st, 1984. They eloped to Nevada. Connie said that Sheila was like the slave of the house. She did all of the cleaning, scrubbing, washing, and she was the one sent to the store most of the time. When Sheila or Terry or Susan got too far out of line, Teresa would still call on Howard to come beat them into submission. Unlike the boys, the girls were not adjusting quite so well to their new home. Their only means of escape were drugs. By the spring of 1984, Teresa had blown through the money she got for selling the house, and she was back to scraping for pennies. One of the ways she decided to boost her cash flow was to put her daughters to work as prostitutes. Susan was turning tricks in different car lots. Terry would go along just to keep an eye on them, but Susan and Sheila were supposedly made to be working girls. Teresa did not reward Susan for prostituting herself and bringing all of her earnings home to her mother. She began to think that this, too, was all part of Susan's grand scheme somehow, although it was her idea, along with the wait spell. Instead of thanking her for whoring herself out so they could buy food and pay the gas bill, Teresa began to think that Susan was screwing the guys not for money, but for leverage to get out of the house. She saw this as a control play, and that's when she really started beating Susan, worse than ever before. Susan was made to kneel for hours, with her eyes aimed at the floor. Whenever Teresa would pass by her, she would kick her or try knocking her down with her fists. She was now made to sleep on a blanket and pillow on the dining room floor. The rest of the children were forbidden to speak to, look at, or go anywhere near her. If any of the children gave Teresa a glance when she beat Susan, then they got beat as well. Terry remembered once when her mom was standing on Susan's throat until she was convulsing on the floor. Then Teresa pounded on Susan's chest. When Teresa gave her food, Susan would just not eat at all now. So Teresa would leave the plate of food in front of her, sometimes for days at a time. She had that whole rule about the children always cleaning their plates. Susan grew more pale and sick with each passing day, and Teresa stuck to the force feeding. If she wasn't eating the food constantly, Teresa would smack her on the head or back or wherever until she started eating again. After a while, though, from her spot on the dining room floor, Susan would just pass out instead of finish the food that was in front of her. It got to a point where she wouldn't wake up at all. She was breathing, but she wasn't conscious. Shortly after the 1st of July, Teresa and Susan called a temporary truce. Following a pattern that was now all too familiar to the children, Teresa had went into a psychotic fury one night and thrown a pair of scissors at Susan when she had her back turned. The scissors didn't kill her, but they did stick into her back. Susan took a chance while they were in this truce and asked permission to leave. She said that she would never reveal anything to anyone, not the beatings, not the shooting, not even the scissors. All she wanted was a plane ticket to Alaska so she could start a new life. She was going to become a hooker for the men who worked at the Alaskan oil pipeline. Teresa thought about it and she agreed. She said she would buy Susan a ticket to Alaska on one condition, that she let her remove the bullet that remained lodged inside her body. She didn't want there to be any chance that that bullet could somehow ever be traced back to her. Susan agreed to the operation. So she ordered Susan to swallow a handful of green Mellorail capsules and a whole lot of hard liquor. Susan passed out on the pillow and blanket where she had been sleeping for several months. Teresa got an X-Acto knife, peroxide, gauze, and a few other things. They had also made these butterfly bandages that they had made by cutting down regular bandages with scissors. Robert was told to cut into Susan's back and take the bullet out. It wasn't in very deep. Robert said he only had to cut one layer of muscle to get to it. After the first couple layers of skin, he said you could see the black mark on her back where the bullet was, and feel the lump. The next day, Susan came to. She was groggy and in pain, and she never really came out of the grogginess. She just kept getting worse. For the next week, Teresa fed her daughter antibiotics, anti-inflammatories, and painkillers. but Susan still was getting worse, and she started hallucinating. She actually mistook one of her brothers for her grandfather. Then she would pass out into like feverish babble. She was describing her life as a movie passing before her eyes, and she just kept going downhill until she was in a state of delirium. Susan's eyes had turned a yellowish green, as if she were suffering from jaundice. She could no longer control her bowels. Sheila and Terry took turns changing makeshift diapers that they pinned on her. Susan's conditions deteriorated to a point where she could no longer even take liquids. On July 15th, Teresa had packed up all of Susan's stuff into plastic bags. She told Bill that they were going on a car ride. Teresa set 2 garbage bags containing all of Susan's personal belongings, including clothes and books, next to her weakening daughter. She ordered Bill and Robert to pick Susan up off the dining room floor and carry her out to the car. So they picked her up and took her outside and put her in the back seat of the Cougar. Then they all drove off. Robert and Bill propped Susan up as best they could, and they had Terry sit on top of her to hold her in place. Sheila sat on one side and Robert on the other, and Bill sat up front while Teresa was driving. After a short time on the road, the engine of the car began making a terrible noise, and Teresa said a rod was knocking, and without a word, she just turned the car around and they headed home. The kids all unloaded everything and put Susan back on the floor where she had been. The following night, July 16th, the family got a later start and used a different car. It was near midnight when Teresa told all the kids to load up the Ford and get ready for another ride. This time Terry was told to stay at home. They drove until just a mile or two before they would have passed through the Donner Pass town of Truckee, on their way towards the Nevada border. Teresa turned off the interstate and headed south on Highway 89, driving down the forested ridge that led down towards Lake Tahoe. She pulled to the side of the road next to the Squaw Creek Bridge. She told Bill to get Susan out, and he and Robert unloaded their sister onto the ground next to the car and got back in. Teresa told them that they weren't finished. They were then told to unload the bags containing all of Susan's belongings. They did and sat them on a sandbank down near the creek bed. Then they picked up their sister one last time. They tucked the bags with her belongings beneath her and zipped up her yellow parka to keep her from the cold. Teresa had brought a gas can, and she threw gasoline all over the place. She then started dousing Susan, the shrubs, and a bunch of grass and stuff around her. She then told the boys that she was going to run back to the car. She told Bill to light a match, drop it, and run. And he did. Detective John Fitzgerald was only one of the deputies, paramedics, medical examiners, and other officials that showed up at the Highway 89 roadside next to Squaw Creek the morning after Jane Doe, number 4858-84, was discovered. Fitzgerald was one of the last sheriff's deputies to see Jane Doe, but he got a good look at her. Only half of her face remained, but he could tell she had once been a beautiful girl. Her skin that remained was beautiful porcelain, and her long blonde eyelashes were the same color as her golden hair. She wore a melted yellow nylon windbreaker. He hoped to God that she had been dead before the fire had been started. Things went back to normal, or as normal as could be, back at the house. Teresa and Bill got into it because she heard that Bill was telling the neighbors that he was paying all the bills, so she told him to get the fuck out and go pay his own bills. He wasn't allowed to get anything, not even his toothbrush. He said that it was probably the best thing that ever happened to him. He moved into his girlfriend Emily's apartment a couple miles away. At 13, Terry watched her remaining sister become little more than a zombie. Sheila was ordered to clean up the mess in the dining room where Susan had spent her final days. She did as she was told. Terry and Robert went to a school friend's birthday party, and they had forgotten the presents. Teresa thought for sure that they had been lying about the birthday party and were probably out engaging in some kind of sexual activity. The more they denied it, the more Teresa believed that Robert was lying for Terry. So Teresa decided to give Terry a haircut to make her less popular in school. She shaved her head bald, claiming that it was punishment for sluts in the old days. Terry cried, but her mother told her to be still or she would slice her head open. That winter, Sheila was out riding her bicycle, which in itself was odd behavior, as she was a bit of a recluse thanks to her mom. She was hit by a hearse. Teresa began wondering what her daughter was doing near a mortuary in the first place, and she was convinced that Sheila's soul was knocked out of her body for a split second and something else jumped in. She told Terry that Sheila had actually died when that hearse hit her, and she was just a demon in her sister's body now. Teresa took to beating Sheila a lot. A man named Lucian King had a little trailer next door to the apartments on Auburn, and Teresa originally approached him to see if he wanted some help cleaning the place up so she could make some extra cash. He took her up on her offer, but the job soon fell to Sheila. Sheila gave her mom all the money that she was paid for cleaning the trailer, but Teresa accused her of prostituting herself to this guy to get more money that Teresa didn't know about. Teresa confronted Sheila with her thoughts about Lucian King. Sheila denied that anything was going on with the old man. Teresa slapped her mouth and called her the same names she had once used for Susan: a lying, whoring, demon-infested slut. From then on, Teresa made Terry take on the cleaning job. As punishment, aside from a beating, Sheila was made to sit on her knees with her hands in her lap and stare for hours at the edge of the carpet next to the kitchen. She wasn't able to look at anyone or talk to anyone. If Sheila moved to adjust her weight or scratch her nose, Teresa beat her with her fists and feet. She tied her up with strips of sheets. Terry was made to feed Sheila because Teresa refused to untie her. Teresa was really starting to lose her mind. She was beginning to think that Susan had given her a venereal disease from using the toilet seat after her, and she was convinced that Terry had gotten it too. She drove Terry to Carson City, Nevada, and made her have a pelvic exam. Teresa watched to see how the exam was done, so when she got back home, she could do her own pelvic exams on her daughters. By this time, Sheila never left the apartment. She was punished every single day, and she had no appetite. In the spring of 1985, she fell into the same pattern as her sister had done just 1 year earlier. Teresa saw her refusal to eat as an act of defiance and began force-feeding her the same way she had Susan. During one feeding, she rammed the spoon so far into Sheila's mouth that she broke one of her front teeth. But Sheila continued to remain defiant. She thought she would be able to get away one day and that she could run off with a boy she liked, who lived in the trailer park next to their apartments. She had something to live for. Sheila was the only one with the nerve to talk back to Teresa. One day there was an argument because Sheila had stopped eating and she was going through some of the same symptoms that Susan had gone through. Robert was told to grab a hold of Sheila while they argued. Teresa slapped her a couple of times, and Sheila kicked her in the shins. Teresa claimed that Sheila had broken her shin. So she ordered Bill and Robert to wrestle their sister down and shut her in the linen closet in the hallway of the apartment. She screamed and fought, but she was no match for the two boys. They finally got her inside the closet and shut the door. The only thing Sheila did in the closet was beg to get out. Teresa stuffed towels under the door so they couldn't hear her. It was hot, and the apartment didn't have air conditioning. Sheila's prison was a 2 by 2 foot space that was 4 or 5 feet deep at most. After a few days, she stopped yelling and pleading and scratching the wood, asking to be let out. No one remembers Teresa ever opening the door to feed her or let her go to use the bathroom. One day, Terry was left alone in the house with Sheila, locked in the closet. When Terry was absolutely sure that she was alone, she opened the door to the closet. Sheila's hands were tied and she was half naked. Sheila was 20 years old and Terry was 14. Sheila's body was all sweaty and hot, and she was super tiny. She looked really bad. When she opened the door, Sheila just fell out onto the floor. She was crying that she wanted something to drink. So Terry took her a beer. That was all that Teresa had wanted her to drink. Terry heard her mom's car pull up, and in a panic, she put Sheila back in the closet and shut the door. It's not remembered exactly how long Sheila was left in the closet. It may have been a week, 2 weeks, or even more. Robert said he didn't remember how long, but he did remember the smell. Teresa and Terry were sleeping in the bedroom together, with Terry on the floor. William was in the shower, about to leave for work, when they heard this noise in the closet. Teresa told Bill to open the closet door, and Bill peered inside and saw his half-sister, naked except for a pair of underwear. Her hands remained tied behind her back, and her knees were pulled into her chest, in a fetal position. Teresa told Bill to remove the closet door and set it aside so that he and his brother could get Sheila out. Bill said that there was a sort of pine cone-looking pattern that had started halfway down her legs, and then it got darker and darker and almost purple towards the bottom. Teresa told Bill to pick her up, and the horror was far from over. When the two boys tried lifting their sister's corpse out of her closet prison, her rotting flesh stuck to the floor of the closet. William said she had no nose when he first looked at her inside the closet, but he would not go into further detail about it. Terry shrank back in a corner, watching her worst nightmare repeating itself. Teresa started barking out orders to her sons, and she brought out a large moving box and told them to put her in the box. Teresa lined the box with a couple of pillowcases after checking them carefully for hairs that might be traceable to the family. They taped the box shut with silver duct tape and carried it to the trunk of the car. The nightmare car ride from a year earlier was repeating itself. Only this time, Sheila was in the trunk of the car. Teresa missed the Highway 89 turnoff and drove towards Nevada. But when she saw a suitable place by the side of the road and little traffic, she pulled over. Bill and Robert had shovels out and were starting to dig a hole to bury the box when a squad car pulled up behind them. Teresa handled the situation calmly, explaining that she had to pull over so the boys could pee. Bill was terrified that the officer was going to be able to smell the box. The patrolman believed Teresa, though. He told her that they had to leave and get back on the highway, and that's what they did. Teresa drove back through Truckee and headed south towards Tahoe, as she had done the year before. This time she took a road that wound through a mountain meadow where Martis Creek formed a shallow lake before it feeds into the Truckee River. She made a left turn onto a gravel road and drove down to the edge of the lake near a campground. She stopped and told the boys to get her out. Bill and Robert got out, dropped the box probably 10 feet away from the car, and they drove off again. On June 21st, 1985, Elmer Barber went down to the lake first thing in the morning, as he always did. He and his wife Hazel were the campground's official caretakers. They were used to people dumping their trash, and when Elmer came upon the box, he assumed it was just another trash dump. The cardboard box was about the size of a TV set, and Elmer walked over and opened the box. When he opened it, arms flew out at him. The body was really stuffed in there, so opening the top released it, and it was a really stinky mess. Police concluded that when she had been alive, Jane Doe number 6607-85 had probably weighed between 105 and 120 pounds. She had dark hair and pierced ears, and must have been around 20 years old. She was wearing only hip-hugger panties and a pair of white athletic socks. She had been hog-tied with an ace bandage type of material and stuffed inside the box. There were a couple of pillowcases in with her, but nothing else. It appeared as if she might have been hit in the head, and suffered a possible slash of 2 to 4 inches in length across the center of her chest. Jane Doe number 6607-85 was in such an advanced state of decomposition that it was impossible to say with certainty that either of those wounds caused her death. After examination and re-examination, the coroner listed the cause of death as unknown on the autopsy report. There was nothing to connect this Jane Doe with a woman still known as Jane Doe number 4858-84, who had been found just a few miles away only a year earlier. Jane Doe number 6607-85 was so badly decomposed that detectives were not even able to get a usable set of fingerprints from the body. Nevertheless, the fingers and palm were kept following the autopsy, along with samples of her hair and her clothing. They may be useful in the future for identification purposes. The sheriff's office sent the Barbers a letter about 6 months later saying that the murderer had been caught. Even though they had found the killer, the authorities were never able to identify the girl. Their idea was that she was picked up as a streetwalker who got into an argument with some guy. They seemed to think it was this one guy and that he had broken her arms and legs, stuffed her in a box, and sealed it. Nevada County Sheriff's Office believed the man who was responsible for the murder was a 42-year-old long-distance Texas truck driver named Benjamin Herbert Boyle. Boyle had been arrested and charged with the rape and murder of a 20-year-old Amarillo woman on October 17, 1985, just 4 months after Jane Doe's body had been found near Truckee. The woman from Amarillo was named Gail Lenore Smith, and she had caught a ride with Boyle on Interstate 287 from Fort Worth on her way to Amarillo. Her naked body was found north of the Canadian River, just 14 miles outside of Amarillo. She was tied up and taped into a fetal position, not unlike that of Jane Doe. An FBI agent, Michael Malone, flew in from Washington, D.C. He was sworn in and testified that a fiber found on the body of Truckee's Jane Doe, number 6607-85, matched fibers from a blanket found in Boyle's house. Boyle was subsequently convicted and sentenced to die in Texas State Prison at Huntsville for the murder of Gail Smith, but not for the murder of Jane Doe, number 6607-85. Nevertheless, the crime had been solved in the view of the Nevada County Sheriff's Department. After returning to the house, it fell to Terry to clean the closet. She said she would never forget finding chunks of her sister's flesh stuck to the floor. Terry started to build a tough skin towards her mother, and she really never gave in to her. She continually did things to get punished. She went out of her way to make sure she got into trouble. Terry's grandfather died when she was 15, and by that time, she had already given up on school and was working part-time at Del Taco. She eventually got her mom to forge a birth certificate so that she could pass for 18 and work full-time. Aside from that, Teresa did nothing to help her daughter. And Terry was disgusted by her mother, and gradually, she started to let her mother know just how much. Teresa tried putting Terry in a closet, and Terry went crazy. She screamed, and her mother accused her of screwing someone in a car at Del Taco because she was 2 minutes late coming home from work. Terry was able to fight off that attempt, but she knew that it was just a matter of time, so she tried to steer clear of her mother altogether. Terry went into survival mode and did whatever she had to do to stay alive. Sometimes she would wake up and find her mother towering over her. She would be blocking the doorway, so there was no escape route. This is when Terry's beatings started, and she also started handcuffing her. Howard moved back to the house temporarily, and the beatings stopped while he was home. Getting Howard back in the house pleased Teresa, even if the only reason for his return was not the best. He had been arrested for beating his son within an inch of his life. Even after Howard returned home, the subject of the two missing sisters never came up. It was as if they had never existed. Except for the linen closet. Teresa had tried to have it cleaned, but she was afraid that some of the blood had soaked through the wooden floor, so she decided that it needed to be burned down. By September of 1986, Teresa's paranoia got the best of her. She concocted a plan to wipe out the linen closet and any evidence it may hold. She began by moving the family furniture and personal belongings to a cheap motel a few blocks away. Robert did the same. The next part involved Terry. Teresa and Terry were still constantly fighting, so Teresa offered her daughter a compromise. If Terry would set the apartment on fire after Teresa and Robert were completely moved out, then Terry would be free to go. So Terry wore gloves, sprayed charcoal lighter fluid all around the apartment. She threw a match on the floor, climbed out a signed window undetected, and ran down the street to the motel where Robert and Teresa were waiting for her. The fire trucks arrived a lot sooner than Teresa expected, and the apartment only suffered minor damage. The fire department knew right away that the fire was set intentionally, and they were able to track down Teresa and her two remaining children. Teresa came up with some story, blaming Howard for the fire, although he had a pretty good alibi, since at this time he was sitting in jail. They confirmed that Howard was in fact in jail, so he couldn't have set the fire, but when they came back to question Teresa, it was like she had fallen off the face of the earth. She and Robert had actually just moved down the street to another cheap motel, but not before Teresa and Terry had their final showdown. According to Teresa, their deal was no longer on because Terry did not set the apartment on fire correctly. If she had, then arson investigators would not be snooping around. Teresa started beating Terry, and Terry yelled at her. She made a big scene, and the managers of the motel called the police. The police arrived within minutes and saw the incident as a typical white trash domestic violence call. As soon as the cops left, Teresa pulled a knife on Terry. Terry said when she saw the blade, visions of her sisters flashed through her mind. Terry grabbed Teresa's arm and flipped her around. She looked her mother square in the face and said, "You're never going to fucking touch me again. Get your fucking hands off of me." Teresa kept coming at her though, but Terry was too quick. Teresa called out to Robert for him to hold his sister so she could get the thrashing that she needed. Robert, however, didn't even try to stop his sister. He had never seen her like this before. Terry backed up the front door triumphantly. She never took her eyes off of her mom. Teresa had beaten her for the last time. And once she was outside, she turned her back on Teresa and walked away, free. By the autumn of 1986, Robert was the only child that Teresa had left. He became even more constrained. He wasn't able to go out anymore, and he had to come straight home after work. At 16, Robert had become his mother's sole caretaker, and she was his sole taskmaster. For the next year or two, Terry's life fell into a general pattern. She stayed with acquaintances who she would run into at work or out at night while she was partying. And after a few weeks, months, or sometimes days, she would wear out her welcome and move on to the next open door. Once, an older friend, who meant well, saw what drugs and alcohol were doing to her and turned her into Sacramento County's Child Protective Services. She was taken to the receiving home and was moved through the county's runaway system, from the receiving home to foster care to group homes, where troubled teens were supposed to receive counseling and education. All these places did for Terry was make her angrier. Once, with the help of one of her foster families, she was able to reach out to her father, Bob Noir. She was 16 at the time. Bob had divorced his second wife in July of 1985 and was married a third time to a woman with children of her own, including a daughter around Terry's age. The Noirs didn't have a lot of room, but Bob welcomed Terry home if she wanted to stay. The homecoming Bob had imagined for his youngest daughter with Teresa did not turn out as he had hoped. She was evasive when he asked about his other children. Terry told him that Susan had run off to Alaska and that no one had heard from her in years. and that Sheila had eloped with some Indian guy somewhere to the north, maybe Canada, and no one had heard from her either. Terry was told while at the Noir's house that she had to follow the same rules as everyone else. So go to school, don't smoke, don't go out on school nights, and be in by 12 on weekends. About 2 days later, Terry was gone. Terry repeated the same pattern again and again. She would get a boyfriend and taunt him into getting in an argument with her. One day, while she was with some friends she had met on the streets, Terry was driving down a street near her old neighborhood, and she spotted a couple of familiar figures on the sidewalk. She saw her mom and Robert walking, and when she yelled out to Teresa, Teresa just looked straight at her and then turned around and kept walking. Her friend pulled the car over, and Terry chased her mother down. Teresa offered to take Terry out to eat, so she and Robert and Terry met with a couple of Terry's roommates at a restaurant and made a night out of it. Robert remembered his mom transforming herself from a strict disciplinarian who was too sick most days to even get out of the house to a trollop who was propositioning the waiters. Later on, they would all end up back at the apartment where Terry was living with two older guys. Eventually, everyone crashed, including Robert. Sometime in the middle of the night, while the apartment was quiet, Teresa shook Robert out of a drunken sleep. She scolded him, saying that they could have gotten killed. They had no idea who these people were. She put all the blame on him for being there. She continued to berate him as they snuck out and returned to their own place. This was the last time Terry ever saw her mother. Robert was out of a job, so when Teresa told him that they were moving to Reno, he put up little resistance. In Reno, they moved into a rooming house with no name over a small Korean-ran grocery store. Teresa got so paranoid while they lived in Reno that she refused to even drink the water. She thought it was poisoning her. She ended up getting sores on her tongue from dehydration. Robert hadn't gotten past the 8th grade, but he was a seasoned con man before he had turned 18. They were in Reno less than 3 months when Robert's drug habit and druggy friends started getting into trouble. He was arrested for the first time for vagrancy and prowling. He spent 5 days in the Reno County Jail. He believed that happened somewhere around December of 1987. A few months later, Robert and a friend were arrested for breaking into a school and trashing it. Later that same year, he and 2 others were busted for attempting to break into a car. After stiffing the landlord at their first place, Robert and Teresa moved from apartment to apartment. His mom had found a job cooking, and he was able to get a job as a dishwasher at Horaz, using the name Ron Bullington. He seemed to do well at the job, and he and another guy he worked with decided to get an apartment together. Teresa took the news pretty badly and went to his work demanding to see the head of personnel. Robert was summoned from the kitchen to join Teresa, who was seated across the desk from an employee representative. Teresa revealed that her son was not Ron Bullington. She told the employee rep that he was a drug addict and a criminal. The employee representative asked him if he still wanted to work there, and he said that he did. So he was told that he could continue working there. They just needed to switch everything over to his legal name. Teresa went off, but Robert didn't lose his job. She still didn't drive him away from her, though. His plans to move fell through, and he continued to help with rent and groceries and help take care of his mother the best that he could. They were like 2 weeks behind in rent, and one day Teresa came home with a bruise on the inside of her arm. She said that Robert had had someone kidnap her, and that they had injected her with some kind of drug that threatened to kill her. She no longer wanted to live with him, so she left and came back the next day with the police. She tried to fight with him while she was gathering what she wanted, with the cops watching. The next day, she left a couple of bags of groceries for Robert, and that was the last he ever heard from her. Terry spent a while either high and dreamy or sober and angry. She was fighting with boyfriends, scrounging up enough money to buy food and shelter, or looking for a drug and alcohol escape from the nightmares of her past. Once, when Terry got good and drunk, she told a friend, Lena, what had happened to her sisters. Lena owned a lingerie shop, and for a short time, Terry became one of her models and came to live with her and another one of the models. Lena gave her a makeover, taught her how to dress and do her makeup, but Terry still cried herself to sleep at night. Lena told Terry that she needed to go to the police, but Terry was afraid that she would be considered an accessory. The next day, Lena gave Terry half of a Valium and drove her to the law offices of John Verga. He told Terry that since she was legally a minor, there wasn't anything that could be done to her, and that she had done nothing wrong. He taped Terry's statement and promised to get back with her once he checked it out. Before she could find anything out, though, she accidentally crashed Lena's car, and she did what her mom had taught her to do. She ran. Robert had no idea where his mom had gone, so he stole a car and drove back to Sacramento in the spring or early summer of 1988. He wasn't really headed back to find Teresa, but he thought he may be able to find Terry or Howard or Bill and figure out what he should do with his life. Unfortunately, nothing turned up. Over the next 3 years, while he was not in jail, Robert was getting high. He was tallying up more and more arrests as he floated through life. Each time he got high enough to be stupid, he found himself in police custody. In 1989, he got a burglary conviction and spent several months at a minimum security facility in northern Nevada. The following year, Robert was busted for felony possession of a firearm and for possession of methamphetamine. This time, when he was convicted, he was put in a regular state prison. He was shipped to the southern part of the state and did 18 months. He had met a friend in the last facility he was in named Brian McNary. The two became best friends, and when he was released, he was within a few miles of Las Vegas and Brian McNary. By now, the pattern was deeply ingrained, and Robert was back in trouble within a few weeks. Sometime after 2 a.m. on November 7th, 1991, a 36-year-old bartender named Robert Arthur Ward was executed at a cocktail lounge about 2.5 miles from the trailer park where Robert and McNary were living. The killer fired a .25 caliber pistol 3 times into his skull and took about $100 from the cash register and another $800 in coins from the slot machines. Investigators found a witness who described 3 men who had fled the bar sometime after 2 a.m. From his description, a couple of sketches were drawn up and published in the local newspaper. The sketches resembled Brian and Robert. In addition, forensic specialists dusted the cocktail lounge from top to bottom and found both men's fingerprints on drinking glasses and on pool cues. Within a week, the trailer where they lived was found and surrounded by half a dozen officers. The next day, robbery and first-degree murder charges were filed against the pair. Both men were held without bail and didn't get to go to trial for nearly 18 months. On May 25, 1993, the day before the jury was to hear opening arguments, Robert and McNary cut a deal. They agreed to testify against the third man involved, and in exchange, the district attorney allowed a plea for a second-degree murder, and they would not face the death penalty. The next day, another inmate at the Clark County Jail chased Robert down and beat him to a pulp, calling him a dirty snitch. On July 1st, 1993, Robert Noir, 24, and Brian McNary, 24, were sentenced to 15 years in the maximum security Nevada State Prison. The third man who was allegedly involved was never charged. Terry Marie Noir, who is now Mrs. Michael Groves, in October 25, 1993, was now living in Salt Lake City. Over the past 5 years, she had done it all, from sleeping in the dirt to eating in the best restaurants. She had gotten pregnant only to discover it was a tubal pregnancy and that the likelihood of her ever being able to have children was slim at best. She had been married 3 times, 2 of those to the same man, a Salt Lake City Mormon named Michael Groves, who still lived with his parents. The third marriage, sandwiched between the 2 to Groves, was a 1992 union with an auto mechanic named Dennis Roper. She told Michael the truth about her mother, her brothers, her sisters, and her own tragedy. Michael was stunned. He thought that if the murders were true, why had nothing ever been done about them? Terry began telling her story to others as well, and eventually she told the story to Heidi Sorensen, the ex-wife of Michael's best friend. Heidi told her to quit carrying the burden around and unload it on the police. Let them track down her murdering mother. Heidi's sister once dated a cop in Woods Cross, a tiny settlement about 10 miles north of Salt Lake City. Maybe he would listen. Woods Cross had a population of 6,000 since the city's founding in 1960, and exactly one murder had been committed there. Nevertheless, when Police Chief Paul Howard got a briefing on Terry's story from one of his patrolmen, he insisted on taking a formal statement. He sent a 1.5-page letter to the Sacramento police summarizing Terry's statement, although he found the story bizarre. He specifically pointed out that she said one of the bodies had been dumped near Truckee. He addressed the letter to Lieutenant Ken Walker, the head of the Sacramento Police Homicide Division. The letter was postmarked September 5th, 1990. Lieutenant Walker assigned a detective to check Terry's story out, and a few weeks later, after checking on identified female bodies in Sacramento and even phoning Nevada County authorities up in Truckee, the detective claimed that he had found no matches, and the information was apparently bogus. Michael and Terry were together nearly 1.5 years before Terry decided to leave him. He wouldn't move out of his parents' house, he was drinking up all their money, and they never did anything but sit around. When she broke it off with Michael, and he had filed for divorce, Dennis Roper asked her if she wanted to get married. He sent her a bus ticket and asked her to come stay with him in the Los Angeles suburb of Ontario. Dennis and Terry were together about a year, but unfortunately he was just as abusive with her the second time around as he had been the first. When she was pregnant, he had hit her and she wound up in the hospital, and she lost the baby. After the miscarriage, she filed for divorce and called Michael to see if he would take her back. Michael sent her a bus ticket and Terry arrived back in Sandy, Utah on July 5th, 1993, and married him all over again. Mike and Terry got into a big argument over her family one day. He basically told her that she was a liar and that her story about her sister's murder was bullshit. Terry got really drunk and she was watching America's Most Wanted, and she decided she wanted to get on the phone and do something about it. She reached a woman named Sherry, who told her that they really couldn't help her at the show because the crime had not yet been investigated. But she did suggest that Terry call the county where the crime had occurred. Terry wiped away tears, got out a map and a phone book, and started calling directory information for Northern California. She got the number for the Nevada County Sheriff. She called and got a desk sergeant who told her that Ron Perea was the only homicide detective and he wasn't there at that hour. She left a message, and the very next day, Ron Perea called, and she told him what she knew. He said that he thought it would be a Placer County case, but he was going to check it out and get back to her the following week. 2 days later, Perea called the Placer County Sheriff's substation in Tahoe City and got Sergeant John Fitzgerald. Perea had checked his files and found a Jane Doe that had been dumped near Martis Creek Campground back in 1985. But the case had been inactive for several years because the blame was fixed on a Texas trucker. Terry's father-in-law called her the next day at work to tell her that some cop from California had been calling her over and over for the past several hours. When she called the Placer County Sheriff's substation in Tahoe City, she was told that Sergeant Fitzgerald had left for the night. Terry was adamant, though, and she said she didn't think that he had, and to please go look, and that he would be waiting for her call. Moments later, a friendly voice came on the line. Fitzgerald began by telling Terry that he was fairly certain that hers was the call that he had been waiting on for many years. Terry talked as fast as she could. She was very emotional and upset. And the following day, Sergeant John Fitzgerald and Inspector Johnny Smith flew to Salt Lake City. For most of the afternoon, they sat at Terry's dining room table, taping her statement. Sergeant Fitzgerald and Inspector Smith felt that they had more than enough information to seek a warrant. The following week, they asked the Placer County District Attorney to begin preparing a case against Teresa Jimmy Cross, William Robert Noir, and Robert Wallace Noir Jr. for 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of conspiracy to commit murder. Robert was easy enough to find since he was already serving a 15-year sentence for second-degree murder in a Nevada prison. William actually wasn't difficult to locate either. Within 4 days, Placer County Sheriff's Lieutenant Chal DeSecco was knocking on the front door of the Sacramento area apartment that Terry's older brother shared with his wife of 2 years, Delois Ann Noir. He asked Bill to accompany him to the sheriff's department up in Placer County, and he taped their conversation along the way. He told Bill, who now preferred to go by William, that they basically had a warrant for his arrest. William had worked so hard to overcome his roots, he explained. He married a vivacious, ambitious young blonde who worked as an office manager for a franchising company. William himself had worked up to the position of warehouseman at a Sacramento distribution center for the Target department store chain. Despite his lack of high school education, he had done something constructive and positive with his life. He told DeSecco how he had fled his family and went out on his own before he even quit high school, and that he had never tried to get in contact with any of them. In 1988, he did reunite with his father. He was 21 years old and hadn't seen Bob Noir in 17 years. Bob had been overjoyed. He gathered his wife, Jeanette, and their children and drove out to a Carl's Jr. that William had picked out as a meeting place. Bob was teary-eyed, and he shook hands and then hugged the son he had never known. One of the first things he wanted to know was what had become of his other children. He asked about Susan, and William told him what he knew, which was that Susan had run off to Alaska. William said Howard was the same way. He never contacted any of them for the longest time. And then, just earlier that year, he had gotten in touch with William. Neither brother had heard from or about their mother in several years. By the time they had arrived at the sheriff's headquarters, it was time for DeSecco to end the cat-and-mouse game. He took William into an interrogation room and sat him down with John Fitzgerald to take the rest of William's statement. The truths that he had kept locked away in his memory for most of his adult life spilled out onto DeSecco's tape recorder. He told how he had accompanied his mother and brother on the ride up to I-80 back in 1984 and set a comatose Susan out by the roadside with all of her worldly possessions. How their mom doused the entire area with gasoline, and how William was ordered to light that fatal match. He told about Sheila and how he and Robert had been instructed to load her decomposing remains into a cardboard box. He told about the long ride back up I-80 almost exactly 1 year after the burning of Susan. 2 days after Fitzgerald and DeSecco booked William Noir for murder, the story broke on the national news. In the November 6, 1993 edition of the Sacramento Bee, the headline read, "Mother Sought in Grisly Slayings. 2 daughters burned, starved." According to the news stories, the search for Teresa Jimmy Noir, 47, had been extended nationwide. She was described as 5 foot 4 inches tall and 250 pounds, usually working in convalescent homes. The best picture they had of Teresa was a scratched and outdated California driver's license picture that had been taken several years earlier. The best Fitzgerald was able to do was track her last known whereabouts to Reno in 1988. From there, the trail went cold. Terry decided to take matters into her own hands, and she contacted the local TV station, and they put her on TV. She said that her mother was sick and wanted to know what gave her the right to take her sisters from her. A few miles away from the TV studios, in the Liberty Park section of Salt Lake City, a round woman of middle age, a nurse who liked to wear wigs, sat in the front room of her patient's home. The name the woman had given her employer, Bud Sullivan, was Teresa Cross. At the time of the newscast, neither Bud nor Debbie Cheney, whose mother had been under Teresa's care just 2 years earlier, had any idea as to who Teresa Cross might be. She had good credentials as far as the Sullivans could tell, and had earned their absolute trust after just a few months on the job. So when Teresa asked Bud for a $4,600 cash advance the day after Terry went on TV, he didn't hesitate. In November of 1993, while Teresa was packing her bags at the Sullivan house and preparing to get out of town, Fitzgerald was running all of her known aliases through every computer database he could think of. One of them was the Utah Department of Motor Vehicles. In 1992, Teresa Jimmy Cross obtained a driver's license with an address in Bountiful. Teresa and Terry were living about 25 miles apart and never even knew it. Just 10 days after taking Terry's initial statement, the two lawmen were standing outside Teresa's front door with a warrant for her arrest. When they knocked, a chunky woman with sallow cheeks answered the door. She said that it was just herself and the elderly person she took care of there. When Fitzgerald introduced himself and told her who they were looking for, she showed no signs of anxiety. She just repeated that no one was home except for her and the old lady. Fitzgerald felt that the way she looked and the pictures that he had of her, that she was in fact Teresa Noir. And gradually, they were able to coax small pieces of truth out of her. Teresa remained calm, even when the two detectives showed her the warrant. She said that she hadn't known she was going to be going to jail at that time, and asked if she could get someone to take care of the old lady first. They nodded, but Fitzgerald snuck around to the back of the house as soon as Teresa left the front door. And just as he had figured, Teresa was making her way out the back when she looked up and saw the detective waiting for her with a pair of handcuffs. Later that evening, after booking Teresa Cross into the Salt Lake City jail, John Fitzgerald called her daughter Terry with the news. Terry broke down crying. Teresa wasted no time in proclaiming her innocence. She refused to return to California with John Fitzgerald and Johnny Smith, choosing instead to remain in the Salt Lake City jail until Placer County authorities formally extradited her. On November 25th, 1993, she was charged with the torture slayings of her two daughters and arraigned in the Third Circuit Court in Salt Lake City. She was then returned to her cell without bail until the courts could rule on her demands to remain in Utah. Robert Noir Jr.'s court-appointed attorney back in Placer County also questioned whether or not his client could legally be brought back from Nevada State Prison to stand trial along with his mother and brother. Two other troubling questions about the brothers' prosecution were also raised. First, neither Robert, 24, or William, 26, were legal adults when their sisters died. And second, the girls' bodies were found in two different counties. Teresa was finally refused sanctuary in the Salt Lake City jail, and on December 18, 1993, John Fitzgerald flew back to Utah to bring Teresa home to stand trial for murdering her daughters. Teresa's only request was that she be escorted back by train or car because she had a sinus infection and didn't want to fly on a plane. Fitzgerald cuffed her and put her on the first plane out. The following Monday, Teresa and William were arraigned together in Placer County Superior Court. William was wearing a jail-issue orange jumpsuit and was shackled to about a half a dozen other inmates. A few moments later, his mother entered, wearing the red jumpsuit that was issued to female prisoners. William cowered, looked at the floor, and would not make eye contact with her. William's father, who was in the second row of the gallery, was not intimidated by the sight of his ex-wife. As deputies escorted Teresa to a seat at the back wall of the court, Bob Noir sneered and made the following statement.
I hope you burn in hell for what you did to my kids, woman.
Teresa Jimmy Cross was formally charged with 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of conspiracy to murder, and 2 counts of special circumstances, multiple murder, and murder by torture, that could, if proved, result in the death penalty. Because both of her sons were juveniles when the crimes were committed, neither of them had to face the death penalty under California law. Teresa postponed entering her plea until January 31st, 1994. When she finally did answer the charges, she spoke a barely audible "not guilty" to each of the counts against her. William's attorney asked that the trial be moved to Sacramento. Both of the girls had been murdered there, so there would be no dispute over jurisdiction. He also asked that William be tried as a juvenile, and that the possibility of life imprisonment be ruled out. The judge ruled against his motions, but he did set bail at $150,000 for William. Using both the jurisdictional and juvenile arguments, Robert's lawyer managed to hold off extradition until the end of June. All 3 defendants, in People v. Noir, and Cross, were finally brought back to stand trial on June 29, 1994. On August 12th, 4 days before the long-delayed preliminary hearing was to have taken place, the judge gave in and ordered the trial be moved to Sacramento County. Bob Noir found Susan's unmarked grave in the county cemetery and bought a small headstone for his daughter. Howard Sanders found a new fiancée after his divorce from Connie was final. He studied to become a chef, reestablished ties with his sister, Terry, and worked at mending relations with his young sons. William's marriage did not withstand the threat of his trial or the possibility of his imprisonment. Delois left him less than a year after his arrest. Robert struck a deal with the Sacramento County District Attorney in the fall of 1994, volunteering his testimony in exchange for reduced charges. A week before Christmas, the DA dropped all the charges against him involving Susan's murder. By February, the DA had dropped all the remaining charges except the single count of conspiracy to aid his mother in the murder of his sister Sheila. At the beginning of 1995, Teresa and her attorney fought to seek a sanity hearing to determine whether she could or should stand trial. She shaved her head and underwent examination by 2 psychiatrists who arrived at opposing conclusions. Terry Groves tried repeatedly to turn her life around, with mixed results, once she had turned her mom in. Before the first anniversary of her mother's arrest, Terry had divorced, remarried, and filed for divorce again. She moved from Utah to California, working off and on as a butcher's assistant, fast food clerk, manicurist, babysitter, and maid. In June 1994, she married an acquaintance she had met through a friend. By Labor Day, she and her new husband, Bill Gilbert, had broken up and been thrown out of their apartment. 2 months later, Terry was broke, strung out, and paying $50 a month to sleep alone in a lean-to next to a ramshackle trailer in the rundown southwest sector of Sacramento. Terry suffered another tubal pregnancy, and following surgery, was told that she would never be able to have children. On October 17, 1995, a thin, unshackled Teresa Jimmy Cross was back in the Sacramento courtroom. The prosecutor not only spoke of the grisly murders of her 2 daughters, but the continued and ongoing degrees of abuse on all of her children throughout their lives. Judge Ridgway thought that Teresa's crimes represented callousness beyond belief. Teresa destroyed her family through murder, torment, or abandonment, the judge read from a letter that Robert had sent to him. Teresa pled guilty to the murders, and in exchange for the guilty pleas, the prosecution did not ask for the death penalty. Teresa was then sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences. She will be eligible for parole in 2027. Robert was eligible for parole in 2001. 3 years was added to his original sentence for the crime that he pled guilty to committing with his mother. And I recently read an article from August 30th, 2016, that Robert Noir Jr. was sentenced to 8 years and 1 month in federal prison without parole. The charges against him included 2 counts of distributing child pornography over the internet, 1 count of receiving child pornography over the internet, and 1 count of possessing child pornography. I will include the link to that article in the description of this episode. William received probation for his role in the deaths of his 2 sisters, but did no prison time. Instead, the court ordered him to undergo therapy. Now divorced, William lives and works in a Sacramento suburb. Howard Sanders ended up moving to Michigan, and I really wasn't able to find much of anything at all on him. Terry Noir died in St. Joseph, Missouri of a heart attack on December 8th, 2011. She was 41 years old. Okay, guys. That's all the information I have about the murder of Susan Noir and Sheila Sanders. I just want to mention that you can now find us at fatalpodcast.com. And I have a new email address as well. The old one will still work, but you can also reach me at beth@fatalpodcast.com. Also, I've got some merchandise that I ordered recently and it just came in. So I've got some stickers and magnets, and I'd like to have a contest again. So this time, email me at beth@fatalpodcast.com or text me at 812-227-5227 and tell me about the case that got you addicted to true crime. Thank you all so much for listening, and I'll see you next week.